Lesson 4, Oceans Ups and Downs, Investigating Gravity's Effect on the Oceans. Before we begin, let's look at some key terms for Lesson 4. Tides, the rising and falling of the sea due to the attraction of the moon and sun. Gravity, the attractive force between two objects. Neap tide, occurs exactly between the high and low tides when the location of the moon and the sun form a right angle with the earth. Occurs during the first and third quarter phases. Spring tide occurs when the tide is at its highest and lowest when the location of the moon, sun, and earth are in a straight line. Occurs during the new moon and full moon. You can look at the picture below and you can see how the moon is orbiting the earth, and you can see where the sun's location would be. The light blue ring around the earth is showing how the water would be affected by the pull of gravity of the moon. So you can see how the water is getting pulled towards the moon as it goes around. Now the neap tide is formed when there is a right angle. So if you pretend like you start at the sun and draw a line to the earth and now go up to where it stops right now, that would form a right angle. But now it forms a straight line across, and that would be the spring tide. Link. All objects have gravity. The larger the object is, the greater amount of gravity. The moon's gravity is 1/6 that of Earth's. What does that tell you about the moon? Hit pause and write down some of your ideas in your science notebook. So if the gravity is 1/6 of that of Earth, that means that you would weigh 1/6 of that you weigh on Earth. So you could take your weight and divide it by 6. So that means you'd be a lot lighter. You'd be able to jump up and down. If you've seen pictures of when the men landed on the moon and you see them walking, you can kind of see how they kind of bounce a little bit higher than what we would do on Earth. Now think about the sun and how big the sun is. What do you think gravity would feel like on the sun? Obviously it's too hot for us to land there, but with the sun being massive, we'd be a lot heavier on the sun. We wouldn't be able to lift up our heads. Now, imagine it's summer. It's hot, there's no school, and you are on a wonderful vacation to Ocean City, Maryland. You've been working all day on a great 4-story sandcastle with shell windows and sea star flags. You took special care to be sure none of the crashing waves could reach your sandcastle. Time for lunch. You leave the beach, eat, and then rush back to the beach to finish your castle. With great disappointment, you notice that where your beautiful castle once stood is now all water. What happened? Most likely, your castle experienced the awesome effects of moon's gravity. In this lesson, you're going to investigate gravity. Hit pause and go back to the videos that are attached to the lesson. Take notes about what you learn while you listen. You'll want those notes next week. Don't forget to come back to the lesson after you watch the videos. So when you hit pause, go back to your Blackboard site, and underneath this video you should see 2 other videos that you need to watch right now and take some notes while you're listening. Alright, now that you are done watching the videos, you should have some more information about tides and how they affect the ocean water. Now we're going to look at this graph. This graph reflects morning tides for the month of December in 2006 in Ocean City, Maryland. There's a key that shows us we're comparing 2 different lines. This is a line graph. It's showing the change over time. The dotted line shows the low tide, and the other line shows the high tide. Now you can find 0 if you look on the y-axis. We have negative, so these would be not whole numbers. They would also not be integers because we have 0.5, and we all know that 0.5, a half, would not be an integer. But we do have negative space. We're going down below. So think about what 0 would represent. Now, when you look at the lines, compare how they're both changing. As one goes up, the other goes down. Now, in the middle, there are four circles. These four circles are actually going to help us think about what the moon would look like. So, in the circles on the graph, shade and label the new moon, full moon, first quarter moon, and third quarter moon. I would start by finding the spring tides, where the new moon and the full moon is. If you need to rewind and go back to the vocabulary part, and it shows that diagram, and you can watch it again, and maybe that can help you find where you think the full moon and new moon would be. And then you can figure out where the first and third quarter moons would go. Now, label the neap tides and the spring tides. You can just label it on the line. And then your last step, infer why the high tide line and the low tide lines of the graph are close to each other near 12/13/06. So if we go down to the x-axis where there's dates, hope you notice how there's labels. It tells us that these are dates at the bottom. On the x-axis and on the y-axis, they label it feet so we know what those numbers are measured in. And if you go down to the 13th and then look up, you'll notice that's when the two lines get the closest to each other. So try to write down reasons why you think that might be happening. After you come up with those reasons, you are done with this week's lesson. Next week, what you are going to do is write an email, but you're going to write it on paper and pencil. You're going to write about a journey to the moon. And in your writing, you need to talk about what the Earth would look like, and you also need to write about how the moon would impact the Earth with the tides. So you can think on it a little bit, but you'll get more details about this assignment next week, and you'll work on it during Language Arts Workshop. Let's finish up with some questions before we end this lesson. What two large objects are acting on the tides to create differences in the cycles? During what moon phases are the highest low tide and the lowest high tides? What are these tides called? During what moon phases are the highest high tides and the lowest low tides? What are these tides called? That might be a little confusing, but go back and think. When is the low tide the highest? That's what number 2 is asking for. And when is the high tide the lowest? In number 3, they're saying look at those high tide lines. When is it the highest? And then look at the low tide lines, and when are those the lowest? So number 3 is more the extremes. And then in conclusion, how long does it take to complete a cycle of the tides? And the last one, why are spring tides larger than neap tides? You have now completed lesson number 4. See you next week.